It's my very big pleasure to welcome here Bojana, Kunst and Bojana Cvejć. I met both of you through Maska, actually, through the Maska seminar that Bojana was running, that was mentioned before. Yes, this was also because before we heard a little bit about how this meant personally to people, this also meant a lot to me, this encounter with you and with many other people, with Pia, with Jasmina. And the encounter with this kind of way of doing theory that Maska had, which was a way of doing it collectively and by engaging also social, political issues, art, culture, which was something very different from what I was used to in my studies. So here I'm welcoming, as I said, Bojana Cvejć and Bojana Kunst. I think you probably all know them, so I'm not sure how much in depth I should present them, but they're both professors of dance and performance. Bojana Kunst is teaching in Gießen and Bojana Cvejć in Oslo. They're authors of many books that you probably all know very well. They will talk about life, care, self and destruction, about practices of care in art, and about practices of self-immolation as a way of protest. I will give the I will give the word to you now, and I'm happy to discuss then your papers.
Thank you very much. Thank you a lot for the invitation. And with Bojana, we somehow said that maybe we will introduce first, we will talk, and then we go into the discussion. So it's more? Okay. No, then I am not free, you see. Okay, yeah. It's okay, it's okay. I will do it. I think it's, yeah, according to my moves, I think that's better that it's with me and not. So, thank you a lot. I'm still a bit emotional of hearing you speaking, you three also, because I think it was really a wonderful introduction into the conference, also from new editors. I'm very touched. And actually that what I will speak about today is really related to a current work I am working on, and it's very much in a kind of progress. I'm really in the writing, and I just brought some points with me. And that's also how then we somehow entangled with Bojana, that maybe we will cover this interest of us and see what can come out of the discussion. I just want to say a little bit anecdote for the beginning, because here is also the person with whom I wrote the first article for Maska. Vlado is there. I made an interview long time ago, and that was my first interview for Maska. But there is a very funny anecdote connected to that, because Vlado didn't believe that I existed first when I called him. I don't know if you remember, because of my name, so everybody thought it's invented. So. And you cannot imagine how often they ask me that also in Germany now, so it is like it is. Okay, so I was a little bit, stuck with the call to this conference, with one tiny little fragment in the call. And in the introduction, we can read a claim that art field is a kind of a training ground for the future precarious relationship. And with this little point, I would like to start. And for me, it's always a little bit tricky when I read something that art field is a bit special in something, or a kind of a training ground, or that artist is we hear very often that artist is a model of precarious worker, and so on and so on. And of course, even if the self-exploitation and flexibility are obvious when observing the modes of working in arts, especially in a self-organized, independent sector, the claim about this particularity of the art field can be tricky, because also it can very easily oversee the differences in the particular art context and inside art context. And I think that you already a little bit addressed it also in the introduction, actually, what is the current situation. So it does not somehow see that art field is also a contradictory, disproportionate, and often deeply unequal field. And on the other side, also being an artist is not so different from other modes of precarious employment, from other inventions of life, which has to compete and adjust to continuous flexibility and precarity of relation. But at least maybe at sometimes it still have this kind of symbolic recognition and visibility of articulation, and that's why the disappointment coming in the moment where it's actually not possible to continue anymore is even bigger. So when we take art field as a kind of a model or example of other modes of working, we are entering a kind of a slippery field because it's very dangerous that we would cut through modes of solidarity with other precarious modes of living and working, and making a kind of artist profession an exception, or because of its creativity or capacity of invention or whatever. And we are somehow avoiding addressing the inequality, I think, which is even harder, and disproportions in precarious modes of working. The disproportions that are here also according to gender, class, race, economic situation, also health, geographic situation, etc. So precarization of artistic work sometimes produce these totalizing narratives, which can erase important political and economical differences inside the art field. And then the consequence is that the chance is at the end given again to the fittest ones, or to the ones who are somehow able to adjust to the even tighter economic demands and managerial procedures. And with that, precarity again stays as a kind of question of organization, almost like a procedural question, and not actually the question of how to live well together with and among others. And this is the context from which I would like to link in my talk to some feminist genealogy, how actually feminist thinkers in the modern history, let's say from the 70s on, but it will be really a very, like a little glimpses, how they were actually rethink those problems and how can this help us also today to not come into a kind of a totalizing narratives about our situation, but really to think more from the situation, or to take really this situatedness as a way how also to address the questions which are very pertinent. So I think very helpful when we think about precarity is, at least for me, always a proposition of German philosopher Isabel Lorey, and this that precarity is actually part of a general normalization of the precarious living, or what Isabel Lorey names governance through precarity. So it's a very particular form. I will not now go to theoretical details, because she really differentiates between different articulations of precarity, ontological, then the precarity which comes more from social domination. She also used several different names, but what is interesting is that this governance actually opens up totally another way of how to think, how are we governed also through our vulnerability and flexibility, through this ontological disposition of every human being, and what does it then do for our social relations, for our being together, and so on. And we are actually speaking after the period of, let's say, 2-3 decades, where also artists, also with that kind of, let's say that a lot of artistic production was actually like, eating from a kind of a welfare neoliberal cake, but there were only drops that popping up, but there was a huge industry actually made around that. And this is actually contributing also a little bit to this normalization of precarity. And there are many, many different reasons for that. So it's not that who is the guilty one, it's a very complex social and political and economic issue, but a lot of ways how artists were working or organizing, or how these organizations were also functioning, they were really glued together with new forms of dominance and economization, And like economization was tightly glued with experimentation, which is a paradox, but it is like that, with working processes or re-questioning the collaboration processes. There was a lot of talk about professionalization of organization, celebrating internationalization, and overall projective economization of work. And this has, of course, several different reasons, and it's very complex, and it's very much also related with the parallel ways how cultural politics was developing, and the financing, and all these kind of discourses also in the international scene. And it's very interesting to observe this history also from the relationship between East and West, from the, let's say, this kind of wrong like the moment of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then how the international production also happened. And in our own context, or in former EU context, this kind of gluing can, with the normality of precarization or governance through precarity, can be observed in this push, especially from the beginning of from the middle of the 90s, where a lot of cultural politics and organizations were implemented in the discussion on professionalization. And that was a kind of a mean, the way how you have to professionalize to actually then produce art, and so on and so on. So this is one history. I will not go so much into it, but there is, of course, there is, of course, a share, or a curse share art has in these processes. However, that the questions of precarity are appearing as issues when addressing the artistic work is also the consequence of a specific personal, intimate, social, and political disappointment. And this disappointment originates from an experience and recognition in a very intimate level also, coming from modes of exhaustion, or a kind of empty run, in the experimentation with modes of organization, procedures of work, independent, alternative forms of living. They somehow don't open a kind of possibility to live a better life, at least if we speak about them generally. And quite the opposite also in a social context, like you all know, also in the context we are living here today, but in many other environments, there is a very strange shift happening, that life of the artist is devaluated, as understood as a kind of parasitical forms of life, which also shows how support structures of their lives are falling apart. And I would name this crisis more as a kind of a crisis of a general crisis of the sustainability of life. The notion is taken from collective precarias a la deriva, who are also saying that maybe crisis of sustainability of life is a better description than feminist notion of social reproduction, because it kind of showing a different idea of oikos. And I'm very busy at the moment when I'm writing that I try to articulate this oikos, this economic, really like what is this relationality of oikos in the sense of maintenance and not management, but that would need a lot of time also to go into it. But here, like this crisis of the sustainability of life, what does it open? That the self, of course, is the guilty one, because he or she cannot manage. And, but this is, of course, not true. Good life is slipping away because it's becoming structurally, politically, economically impossible to live well, because the whole environments and relations of life, communities, scenes, surroundings are collapsing. And so it's not the fault that the work is scarce and that the work is being more and more insecure or fragmented, but there is a very deep, how to say, almost like environmental, I will use this notion intentionally, it's coming from ecology, almost ecological problem, like how these structures are falling apart. And this collapse is entangled with the value of existence, or more precisely with the differentiation between whose lives are worth living and whose not. So this differentiation is more and more in the core of the current operation of, we can say, biopolitics. We can also discuss it from necropolitical view, but that are no theoretical differences. Maybe I will not go into it. So at the same time, we are still in the situation where at least now we could still come together. So our lives in so-called global north, if we go with this more broader geopolitical notion, are still being somehow protected, but the changes are nevertheless felt, and they are for some already very damaging. So the problem is not only that the life of artists is becoming not worth living, so in the sense, okay, maybe another profession will be better, which maybe for some of the artists still can be an option, or at least to move in a better place. And this is very interesting. When I wrote that down, and now I'm reading it and I'm thinking, yeah, it would be interesting also to, I'm rethinking over and over again why I was living and in a specific moment. What was actually this notion of life? It's a very, very interesting question. And it's also interesting that with the kind of, maybe in one moment when you go, you see it as a kind of individual professional development, but then you always realize you are part of a community of the one who left. And it's a very interesting question also for that. So, but I think that we have another situation now that it's not just that life is not worth living, so maybe there is another possibility, but there is a kind of radical deadlock coming with the experimentation or invention of life, and especially with the neoliberal economy in the last decades. Like, we had this kind of almost like a bizarre situation that it was still possible to squeeze some value out of the creative, flexible, and inventive field, and with acceleration and nomadism and all the time. So it was a kind of, but with the arrival of shifts also in politics, with populisms, with more authoritarian approaches, and with the general shifts actually, which are, of course, from my opinion, all connected with the radical shifts in capitalism, in expropriation, extraction, and of life. So these shifts are taking a different turn. And there is this radical deadlock of any political or poetical immanence and invention of life. And I will just say in a very anecdotic way, now it's possible to produce more, to produce internationally in a kind of a totalizing way, also without an open society, which also totally disappeared. No? Like that's a kind of interesting situation in which we are now. So what is happening is an erasure of experimentation with alternative forms of living, what also Mala was talking about yesterday when she was presenting a book, or a kind of radical disevaluation of an immanent politics, which of course immanent politics is also poetical. It's a very interesting question also, what is erased here. And with that also the radical disevaluation and marginalization of the life of the artist, and that the life of the artist is then popping up like a symptom, is connected to that it's not, I think it's not good to read it from this totalizing story, but it is a symptom of singularity, because it was already under very precarious conditions. A lot of them were already working like that. So that's a kind of a detection of the situation I would like to maybe give it of the moment. And now, interesting is that, of course, there are some examples in history of feminist art which I really like to go back, and there is a movie which I prefer to return several times because I really reread it anew. And this is this very interesting film from '79 from Helke Zander, Reducers, the all-day reduced personality. I was also writing very shortly about it in the book, Artist at Work, but now I'm discovering another dimension of it, also maybe because of the situation from which I try to think about it. And in this film, so it's '79 film, and Helke Zander, just very briefly, she's a feminist activist and filmmaker, essayist. She was very important also as an activist in a social democratic movement for women's rights and so on. So it's quite a well-known person in German history. And she did this '78, this was one of her long movies where she showed the daily life and work of Eda. She played Eda herself. And Eda is this typical precarious worker, a mother, of a single mother of a child. She works as a journalist for Night Chronicle in the night so that she can survive. She's an artist. She has a feminist collective. They work in the weekends because this is the only time where they can work, and so on and so on. So all the things are there in the 79. And now what is very interesting is that this essay is trying to show her life in a kind of, that there is try of emancipation. This is really an ideal of a feminist subjectivity, emancipated, reorganizing her own field of social reproduction, has a collective and so on, but somehow she does not manage. The life is slipping through her fingers. She is more and more exhausted. It's a very, very interesting movie because it's also very ironical. She shows all the paradoxes. So even if there is this reorganization of social reproduction, the old gender divisions are still existing, the stereotypes, the violence, the hierarchies, and so on. And this is how she shows her life through the day. And what for me was interesting in this movie is that it's showing how this creative freedom of protagonist lives actually on the edge of economic marginality, which actually results in even greater dependence. And that means also that artistic and professional emancipation does not mean necessarily the emancipation from traditional stereotypes and expectations. And in this film, especially gender stereotypes and expectations are addressed because that was also the interest of Hilke Sander. So it does not enable a better economic status, and because such kind of work is exactly part of the contemporary exploitation of work. And of course, for me, it's very interesting that this is such a historical work from a first part, but of course we know with these 100 and 200 years that time is relative, and that it's a very actual film about the relationship of production and a very actual critique of a kind of a critique of or observation of that the guilt is not on the side of the protagonist, but really on the side of that environmental structures, or we can also say infrastructures, if we would like to talk with this notion. And what is also interesting is that this film is done exactly in the time when actually late 70s and so on, social reproduction as work was also transformed into core modes of creating value in neoliberal capitalism, like service-oriented, cognitive, affective work. So it has also a kind of interesting historical context. The third quality of that film is that it's shot in Berlin, which was, of course, divided by the wall. And these women who are living this emancipated life and trying to put their work in a public space and fighting for their persuasion, they are continuously comparing East and West in their way of watching towards the wall and so on, and trying to really think what is happening there on the limit between these two systems with female emancipation and so on. And this I found extremely enriching when I watched this film today, and trying to link it also to this, what I said at the beginning, that we don't have these totalizing narratives about precarity, but there are really these differences inside also, from which location, from context, gender, and so on. I think this is very, very present also in the movie by Hilke Sander. And then there is another problem also, which Hilke Sander is not so much directly addressing, but it could be linked to that what was discussed also in feminist theory in the 70s and 80s, especially coming from Black feminist theory, that of course the social reproduction, the way how do we organize and care and establish the relations of life, is not organized in the same way for everybody. And that means that the social reproduction is also not organized in the same way for all the women. And by example, Angela Davis was then in the, she wrote this very interesting chapter in the book Woman, Race and Class, where she was then really trying to analyze the position of white feminists and their resistance, or a kind of their demand for the social reproduction to be evaluated as a mode of work. And she said, yeah, but from the perspective of Black women, it was always work. It was always labor, and not even, sometimes it was slave labor or very badly paid labor. And this is something what I think is very important when we are talking about that organization of social reproduction and so on. So this is something I would like to bring from more historical context into that. Then I was writing that, and then I remembered that years ago, I think I also wrote a text in Maska about that when I was asked, because there was this period when we were writing a lot about East and West and how, and the delay and the time of the East and so on. I think we were articulating a lot. And there was this work of a visual artist I saw in Moderna Galleria. I don't remember the name. I think it was Cvejć, who did this film on the opening of the Haludovo complex in Krk in 70, I think it was 81. And this opening of the Haludovo complex in Krk was done together with Yugoslavian communists and Penthouse magazine. And that was a kind of a sign of an opening of Yugoslavian socialism to the world and to the tourism. And they had this big celebration in the hotel. It was a superb modernistic structure, avant-garde, modern. So we have a lot of melancholia, sometimes today also for this modernist architecture. Not that I'm criticizing it, but the interesting was its relation to the bodies. Because the Penthouse magazine was then, the editor was opening that, and there were like, I think like 20 women in swimsuits behind him. And he said, I'm so proud that we are now collaborating together for a new world. And he showed to these women, he said, because they are the new peace forces of the world. And this is this kind of a paradox which comes. So on one side, you have this really, let's say almost a utopian architectural construction, which has all this kind of, and I know how things are discussed, but on the other side, there is this very interesting relation to a kind of a social reproduction question or a gender question, and what is the role of the body, or whose body actually, and whose body is dressed and whose body is there half naked. So, so that's why now I jump to another point. I know that there is not really a red line in between, but I just want to broad several parts. I'm working now very much with Precarity alla deriva, with their writing again, even if they were having a kind of, they were very much working with their text already in 2002, and were first feminist collectives which were really dealing with precarity. And that's why I also would like to take this notion of the crisis of the sustainability of life and say that it's actually a better description of what is going on as social reproduction. And Precarity alla deriva developed this crisis of the sustainability of life also inside particular context. And this is also very important to understand, not again to totalize. And this is that this sustainability of life is inside a particular geopolitical set of relations. So on one side, we have a crisis of sustainability of life, like impossible to survive, to maintain well, even to die well. This is the crisis of sustainability of life. And this, of course, is connected to the global south, let's say, are saying Precarity alla deriva. And on the other side, it's a crisis of care. So impossible to manage the care well, and its economic disevaluation, which is connected to global north and which we are all experiencing in crisis, which is several months with us. No? So all the symptoms of that crisis of care. Now, this geopolitical setting is very important in our debates, so that we don't forget and are always reminded that we are thinking about those notions, precarity, but also other notions which are now circulating a lot in art discourse, like vulnerability and care, inside those specific conditions. And inside those specific history of political and economic relations to which the very crisis we are living belong. And this is, of course, the history of colonialism, capitalist accumulation, violence, racism, patriarchy, and so on and so on. And this kind of geopolitical frame is actually really a kind of a reminder that we always have to also go back to these relations of space and time. And on the other side, these relations between crisis of care and crisis of sustainability is also belonging to many micro-political situations we are experiencing, and is part of inequalities and disproportions at work when we address the issues like precarity or care in the field of art, by example. I don't know how long I'm still some time. Otherwise I will. Okay, then I will just. Yeah, sorry, I didn't saw the clock now. So now the awareness of that crisis of sustainability of life, of course, reached also art fields in the last decade, let's 2 decades. And it's expressed mostly as the awareness of the precarity of the lives of artists, but also of the others who are, yeah, not so maybe privileged or in a more difficult situation. And we can say generally that we are becoming more aware about the aspects of the social reproduction and experimentation with the labor of artists, that this is becoming more visible, and that there is this focus on vulnerability. And you can also see it in the part of how the events are organized, how there are different kind of ways of how to make relationality between different parts and so on. And there are also several very interesting artists who are really dealing with that, like Jeremy Waite, or also very interesting projects and so on. But there is something what can also become a problem when we go into that totalizing narrative, and this is this I actually will tell you from work of the student of mine, Antonia Rohwetter, who did a very interesting master thesis, and she was studying Berlin art scene and the precarity in the Berlin art scene. And she said that probably the problem is that, that this precarity and care give us kind of a sense of affective community, that the feeling that we are in all of this together, and together also working towards a better life in common. But the problem is, that's how Antonia formulates it, is that these discourses are more or less marked with the optimistic attachment, especially when thinking how are we approaching the notions of care, precarity, as there would exist a better way out coming out of that. So if we would take care more about us, organizing better some services for the artists to support their family life, etc. So she said that the problem is when they become kind of ideologically valuable forms of production and then starting to hide the differences inside them. And these are exactly these differences I was talking about, through which power and hierarchies can be further maintained, like class, economic, health, gender differences, and so on. Because the question is, of course, on the basis of what we are solidary, that we are in the same way exhausted and affected, or based on that, that we are affected, but in a different way with different consequences. And that's why I really like, Alia, where are you sitting, your intervention with your talk, because I think this really touched me a lot in what I think how you were talking also about your working together and your duo in this situation in which you are. So the problem is that these optimistic discourses can return the discussions back to the affirmation of the self and its responsibility, and they can really essentialize specific qualities in the relationship to artists, instead to open up the insight into exclusions, disproportions of power, and hierarchical dependencies on the field. And here the discussion must be done. And this is something what, I would like to bring to that conference also, because we have these 2 very different models, like self-management, precarity, and I was a bit afraid how to grasp them in their totality. So now, just to conclude, I think it's crucial to approach precarity really as the form of governance, analyze then the consequences, what such governance, which consequences of such governance for our lives, among them also lives of artists, and what does this form of governance then does to the political alliances, institutional relations, and forms of solidarity. And in many cases, it is turning the dependency, which is our ontological condition, into the exploitation of potential, and at the same time, the dependency which lies in the core of our political co-being is turned into the procedures of safety and protection, which are always created from a very unequal situation and a demanding, paradoxically, even more efficient management for survival. And that's why I would like to finish with one text and another film. And this is, the text is very short, a text from Sarah Ahmed, where she is actually really trying to rethink and radically criticize the appropriation of self-care and notion of care by neoliberal soft feminism and economy and so on. And she said that exactly that is the problem, that then these discourses are becoming an obscure and optimistic discourse that covers problems, inequalities, and lead us away from engaging in certain kind of political struggle. And it also can cause a powerful division, mostly a good feeling that we care, that the care belongs to us, is also a way to exclude. And I think that this is really especially present in these discussions on care, which are, or especially self-care, which are depoliticizing radical traditions of practice of care belonging to the Black feminists. Now, I was then thinking how to end, to go back actually to our context also of like former Yugoslavia, or the history, which was also the history of self-management and so on, and also very much inspired by what Bojana will talk about later. I remembered one film, and or better lecture of Antonia Maska in Berlin, where she was talking about Želimir Žilnik early works, 1968. And for me, I said this is really interesting to bring it parallel to Helge Zander, to this feminist examination of impossibility of life and so on. And for you who don't know this film, because this film is not very well known now, it's actually popping up also in specific circles of discussions and awareness. It's one of the films from Yugoslavia, new films, this dissident film fashion, which also questioned very much the status quo of bureaucratic state socialism and so on. And this film, in this time when it was made, received very limited reception. And Maika is also saying that because of its gendered address of socialism and the system at that time. And in this film, Želimir Žilnik shows a woman with the name Jugoslava as she leaves her lumper proletariat family to lead a small group of vagabonds after the failed student movement in Yugoslavia in 1968. So you have this situation after the failed student movement, after this emancipatory moment. You have a young woman with 3 men who are going to the countrysides, very relaxed young people, personally, sexually, and so on, very emancipated. And the group travels to the countryside to bring Marx and Engels to peasants, and Yugoslavia passionately wants to emancipate local women about emancipation. However, the group fails with its intentions, and it fails really badly, because they wanted to really integrate this revolutionary program among the peasants' families and the villages, but the villagers attacked Yugoslavia and the young men and sexually harassed Yugoslavia. And then through the film, her revolutionary passion burns, and actually it's really, and at the end of the film, and that's a very short summary because it's a very complex one, she's actually punished for that. And in the last scene, the male comrades choose the heroine. They killed her in a barren, foggy, muddy fields of Pannonia, first harassing her sexually, killing her, and then finally shoot her and set her body in fire. And this is a kind of an end of 1968 and post-1968 emancipation and revolution. So Yugoslavia is set on fire. And I want to bring this film inside because, again, it is, how to say, really bringing us back to that situatedness of our bodies and the way how, with this situatedness of our body, actually emancipatory stories are also told. And that we are not actually getting into this totalization of a specific mode which joins us, but try to think like what are other ways of relating. And also I brought this story inside to actually open the door for Bojana, who will talk about a very specific problem. And I thought this fire at the end of this film can really introduce you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Bojana, for this great talk. I'm so much looking forward to our conversation. And I'm so grateful that Maska has organized this, and like others, I believe that probably people will follow suit. I also have to inscribe myself in this history that was presented in the introduction, where I realized that the first text I've ever written about performing arts was published in Maska via Frakcija, because Frakcija rejected it and said, but we will recommend it to Maska, but to also understand, and there's something that Emil Janis said, to be part of a continuity that is constructed. So thinking in this temporal projection of 100 years from now on, and listening also to Pia and Alja, I'm wondering about this uncertainty of the topology of cultural and political space we will be in, and we still cling to post-Yugoslav heritage, and we have this legacy, but what will be later on? How will it be transformed, and how will we position ourselves? This is what I'm wondering. But I will jump immediately into the talk. And Bojana has given me a wonderful but poignant image for the relay, and I will bring it to the other end of these bombastic words that we put in the title of our session, so towards destruction, self and destruction. I will present an argument that is still in making and comes out of a research that is almost complete, or comes after this research completed into the modes of performing the self in contemporary neoliberalism, a research that I have been conducting with Ana Vujanović. So the topic comes through the lens of performing the self, and it's about the public acts of self-annihilation that protest the unsustainability of life, but by making the body the locus of violent and spectacular destruction. In one word, and I use the technical term because there is let's say, a conceptual debate around terming and the status of these acts as self-burning, but of course it exists, is known as self-immolation or political self-sacrifice by fire, fiery suicide, and so on. In this research with Anna, apart from the individualist modes, we have also placed a kind of affirmative emphasis on the processes and acts in which the self is an agent of collective individuation. So this will be also one of the questions, whether these acts can qualify as trans-individual forms of consent. And trans-individuation comes from a tradition of, or let's say a genealogy that goes from Gilbert Simondon towards more Marxist readings in Paulo Virno and Etienne Balibar. But we're talking about practices and acts that regenerate the potential of human species being. So my wish is to redeem these acts politically and somehow extract them from the discourses that address them, that are mainly liberal and rooted in international law and international relations, as well as media, news media, which is still unfortunately the main source of the cases I have learned about, where they have been disavowed by governments, but also instances that they interpolate. And there's a danger in turning them into an academic case study in political and cultural performance, because the sheer theatrics of self-burning is attractive, obviously, where an individual offers up themselves. For me, it is important to tip it onto the other side, to affirm this piercing or firing into the public sphere, where an individual stages a set of concerns that first appear to be private into a dramatic appeal to the public. So the context of my talk won't be precarity in the modes of production in art and artistic work, and there are clearly no artistic examples of this. But it's the situation in which the basic needs for sustaining life under neoliberalism in Europe and Middle East in the past decade have been violated. And among a myriad of cases, I would like to single out two and give you a very brief description, because these acts triggered me. So to use the word trigger is also tricky, because it points to trauma, but there is a type of implication that is also quite emotional, implication or interpellation. So on October 19, 2017, a Polish chemist who cast himself as a common ordinary man set himself to fire in front of the Palace of Culture and Science in Warsaw. So while he was screaming, "I'm protesting," Piotr Szczesny distributed a leaflet with a long list of political objections that are very lucidly articulated to PIS, the Law and Justice right-wing party that is still in government, appealing to the Polish people to wake up from political slumber. 2 years later, in November 8, 2019, a 20-year-old student and activist of the leftist student union set himself ablaze in front of the building that houses the regional student aid center in the French city of Lyon. The letter that Maska, he's only known by his initials, left explicitly accused the French government and other political figures for the social problems ranging from students' precarization that he felt, that he painfully experienced himself, to poverty, fascism, calling out from Macron to Marine Le Pen, such figures. So both self-incinerations were intended and appropriately framed as political protests, and such have echoed in the public because they gave rise to marches and rallies of Polish citizens and French students. But the main purpose of the protests was to counter the attempt of the governments to obfuscate the political intention of these acts by foregrounding personal depression or distress as the main motive of the suicide. But the French students, they insisted. They stopped François Hollande from giving a talk in Lille saying Maska act was political. So these are fine examples of self-immolation in the lineage which was established as political protest by fire only recently, since 1963. It's the famous Čičigoj self-immolation that circulated as an image and set several waves of self-immolations in the 60s and 70s, among which is Jan Palach, obviously, but also several ones started by the pacifist activist Alice Herz in the US. So once I've learned about this, I started to dig more through this scattered media space to find out that there are more than 100 self-burnings that have taken place outside of the so-called geographical belt, where certain cultural predilections have accommodated it as a public act. So not in Tibet, not in Iran, but in Western Europe and Middle East. The wave has been ignited by the famous case of Mohammed Bouazizi in 2010 that initiated the Arab Spring, or was symbolically taken. But what happens when you see this myriad of unobtrusive, fragmented, dispersed acts which have no roots in a major political movement, because unlike the previous cases, they don't radicalize resistance of an oppressed group, or it's not about pacifism, or there's no religious culture where fire is a purifying device, but the motivations are distinctive, and they point to the struggles for a sustainable, livable life. So it's unemployment, housing crisis, conflicts at work, altercations at work, a life of forced immigration and detention camps, different sorts of injustice resulting from corruption and other forms of precarity. I've tried to systematize reasons as from what I've learned, but among more known cases, workers in the public sector in France, for instance, France Telecom, energy company GDF Suez, public sanitations, teachers. So it's really a wide field of professions, and each story could be told in vivid detail, but would have the similar emotional narrative, highlighting a sense of despondency, disorientation of individuals, which I think if we look for any affinity for this in art would be in the cinema of Dardenne brothers or recent films by Ken Loach. So the act consists in the self-burner who readdresses the unanswered plea to the public, or in other words, they coerce the public to bear witness to the injustice for which they blame the instance symbolically identified in its seat. So the place of the act is a public building or its vicinity, which serves as a context-sensitive stage of the act. But in comparison to these exemplary foundational acts from the 60s and 70s, the conditions for the political performativity of these acts nowadays are only partly fulfilled because they're public, they communicate with the antagonist and a broader public in the symbolic places of state institutions, but because their intentions aren't explicitly deliberated as political, they are denied the status of political protest. So even though the motives point to violation of basic needs and rights to maintain life, they're presented as personal reasons rather than structural, social, or political problems or causes which are shared in common. But of course, the spectacle of the burning body cannot escape the notice of the public eye, as the place and the brutality of the act call for, compel the immediate and remote witnesses to ask why, what for, even in the name of who is this act. However, the interpolated antagonists, which are either employers, public servants, HR services, co-workers, disavow their responsibility for the detriment that the self-burner has made public. Instead, each act is psychopathologized and isolated as a case of individual vulnerability, even deviancy or anomaly. And in that way, it is reduced to a glitch on the flat surface of the media, so you can read it in some back pages of what in France is called faits divers, various facts, or I think there is not a word in English for crna chronika. Therefore, they are presented as if they conclude the personal drama of precarization that resulted in a breakdown. And by precarization, I would like to include here a variety of breakdowns in which individuals become the collateral damage of an infrastructural transformation or failure, ruin. After the Laurent Berland's concept of infrastructure as the living mediation of what organizes life, this excludes more than roads, schools, medical insurance, or families. It encompasses, I'm quoting Berland here, the systems that link ongoing proximity to being in a world-sustaining relation. Now, what is the problem with this? Okay, so this is, I'm going to present the argument now in three steps, because there are three reasons why I believe they merit attention in the context of precarity. And one is more general and obvious, because these acts epitomize necropolitics. They provide poignant performative evidence of the subjugation of life to the power of death. And if we consider them within Achille Mbembe's concept of necropower, They belong to the shadowy social existence in which vast populations are subjected to conditions of life, conferring upon them the status of living dead. This, of course, entails that we expand the notion of living dead to include, besides slavery and death camps, those who are left behind, dispossessed, whose lives are ungrievable, as Judith Butler famously put it, lives that are devaluated, also in the way that Bojana has been talking about it. So it's about subjects who lost the structure of support that sustains their life. And having exhausted other means of struggle for basic source of livelihood and social justice, they choose to end their life in an intense form of embodied protest by self-destruction in public. And I think this intensity and embodiment and also hyper-individualism of this act also attracted me after the study that Anna and I have been doing. So the second reason is, if all self-burnings out of precarity belong to necropolitics, then they cannot be addressed through this dichotomous framework, which harks back even to Émile Durkheim's writing on suicide, that are centered on the notion of self-sacrifice, which classifies between self-immolations as political protests and self-burnings as personally motivated suicides. So it inscribes this dichotomy between martyrs, victims, good, bad death. In the last instance, also life and death. So according to the current discourse on fiery protests, if the person doesn't burn on behalf of others, by explicitly furthering a political cause for a community, their act is not deemed political and thus falls in the category of suicide. And this conceptual dichotomy is inadequate in my view, as it fails to politically recognize precarity. In fact, it only serves to depoliticize and smother what these self-burnings show, that precarization can escalate to become a violation of the right to a quality of life, which is felt as a violation of dignity. And so this is not a personal detriment that some people are just too vulnerable or too proud to live with, while the majority are robust, flexible to survive. But it is an injustice, and it's an injustice that one can also bear witness to, like a martyr, because the original meaning of a martyr is the one who sees truth and injustice. So the famous example that comes to mind is Mohamed Bouazizi. He's probably the icon who has ignited the wave of self-incinerations in the last decade in Europe, and it's not, there is a, let's say, a post-colonial route from Tunisia to France for it to happen, to spread in such a way. And his story is familiar, but I would just mention his dramaturgy because it is somehow the blueprint for these acts. Being desperate after losing the only place in economy available for him, the Tunisian street vendor tried to appeal to the city administrator, who declined to see him, after which Bouazizi returned to the administration building within an hour and set himself on fire. And before he doused himself with gasoline, he was heard screaming at the municipality, "How do you expect me to make a living?" So he left no apparent state of political intention, but a large community of young Tunisians recognized themselves in his despair and chose his act to be the symbol of their protest. There's a lot more to be said about how this instrumentalization of his act happened, which I'm not going into, but the case brings the question if life can be weaponized as a trans-individual form of dissent, rather than a hyper-individualist end of personal despair. And the answer is yes, if it leads to insurgency and the incinerated body is recognized as an icon of resistance, and it manages to interpolate and mobilize a community, which, for instance, the Turkish political commentator Banu Bargu called necro-resistance, which transforms the body from the site of subjection to the site of insurgency. So the prevalent view of the discourse on self-immolations approaches self-burning as a performative in the perlocutionary sense, as a form of persuasion. If the act of self-burning doesn't disclose a political intention, which is what most of these don't, it can still become a liminal act, which earns the status of political protest by the effect. However, a dissent becomes trans-individual not because of a movement beyond a mimetic transfer from the individual to the supra-individual level, but through a process of relations. So transindividuation means that an individual is individuated through the reciprocal individuation of the collective, which needs life and the living and social relations and actualizing social interdependency. So this makes the question of whether political suicide can spark transindividuation very problematic, in fact. But when self-burning makes a public accusation only by the place in which it is staged, and then fails to individuate the community of those who share the condition with the self-burner, it falls under the category of bad death. The phrase has been circulating in British anthropology in the 80s and is also explained as surrendering to the disappointments of life. Now, the good death, by contrast, involves a transfer of the vitality of life, so supreme altruistic gift of the martyr by whose death life is renewed. Obviously, these two epithets of the good and the bad death reinstate this dichotomy of self-sacrifice, suicide, martyr, victim, which operates in the judgments of fiery suicide. So as if a martyr is the one who is superior, obviously, because they defend a principle, a notion of truth, which they cannot surrender, whereas suicide is considered to be egotistical, selfish. It represents, I'm quoting here, a failure of nerve, endurance, or patience, and often in an inability to go on despite grief, pain, dissatisfaction, or deprivation, while martyrdom is selfless. So there are at least three misgivings about bad death that I would like to highlight. First, if the motives of self-burning are relegated to the personal, the actor is regarded as an individual who personally suffers from injustice, someone who is oversensitive, vulnerable, inflexible, or not resilient enough to adapt to changes or infrastructural failures in their life. Rather than a martyr whose act is praised for audacity and generosity, the actor is regarded as a victim, and in liberal legalist debates as someone who can no longer master their life, but then becomes sovereign in refusing life under these conditions. So any argument on individual sovereignty deliberately disregards the social interdependency that underlies all lives, including individuality, which is a social relation. So when it seeks to politically ennoble the victim by attributing to them sovereignty in the last instance, the legalist discourse denies to this act the political function that it confers to martyrdom. So martyr comes from matis, or in Arabic shahid, which is associated with bearing witness to truth or injustice. So must we refrain from victimization and reflect the reasons for this irreparable act in relation to others, to us, even if the act isn't explicitly framed to be committed on behalf of us? So this would mean two things. First, it would emphasize our role as witness to self-annihilation and our responsibility for things seen, by which we might ask, am I implicated in this death? Second, it would underline the relationality of our lives, similarly to the Adornian question that Judith Butler elaborates in her notes towards a performative theory of assembly. I'm quoting now a little chunk from Butler. Implicit in the question of how to live a good life in a bad life is the idea that we might still think about what a good life might be, that we can no longer think of it exclusively in terms of the good life of the individual. If there are two such lives, my life and the good life, understood as a social form of life, then the life of the one is implicated in the life of the other. End of quote. So Islamic scholar who is writing for the Institute for Palestine Studies, Rashid Khalidi, who commented self-incinerations in Europe since 2010, said, "These are ordinary people making eminently reasonable demands for freedom, dignity, social justice, accountability, the rule of law, and democracy." Does this mean that the self-burner drew a line beyond which they refused to accept the changes that call for resourceful and creative adjustments in a space of an ever-shrinking sense of possibility? And I think this is an interesting moment to introduce the concept of plasticity of Catherine Malabou, who has tried by commenting it in a relation between neuroscience and philosophy to repoliticize the meaning and to tweak out the meaning of plastic as explosive in plasticity. So maybe there is a limit to plasticity as an ongoing transformation that these people have touched, as it strikes back in resistance, refusal, rage, and fire. Second objection is centered on dignity. So if these fiery suicides mark a dramatic point in a personal struggle of someone who has exhausted all formal channels of address, so the last resort is to make the plea public by drawing public attention to their suffering, the final act results from the process of precarization that reaches a point in which injustice begins to have a humiliating effect. When it's experienced as humiliation, the person's dignity is violated. Now, if we look into the dead letter, what the dead letter on the paper of international law, the UN Declaration of Human Rights, Article 1 from 1948, says, that would mean in practice that dignity relates not only to a right to life, but a right to the quality of life. And the notion of dignity is unfavored largely in the discourses on precarization, because it opens a kind of confused mixture of connotation. Is it humanist? Is it religious? Is it masculinist, even heroic? Or is it just empty? And I think the emptiness could be taken as a positive lack of normative equation between dignity and a certain quality of life. So a comparison with a Muslim counterpart in the term karama is interesting here. So in Arabic, karama is derived from karam, which signifies generosity. In the words of Muhammad Aish, also an Islamic scholar, karama is highly charged emotional frame through which the individual determines the worthiness of his or her life. If we are to continue this line of reasoning, then we could ask if denying basic rights to a sustainable life is the wrong one can bear witness to, and that bearing witness to that can lead to radicalizing this sentiment in public, and then whether the sentiment can galvanize others to the extent that it can circulate as a public affect. And my third last point is against the self-sacrifice. The dichotomy considers the impact of any self-burning, which is done in protest. So a person who sets their body on fire wants to leave an indelible imprint on the minds of others. So between being an immediate spectator or a second-hand viewer of self-burning, in my view, implies only a difference in degree of intensity, but not a different kind of impression. Of course, I'm suggesting this without ever testified to self-burning in situ, so it's only a bold estimate. But all the images of self-immolations that have circulated in the media support imagination of the ordeal. What is there to witness or imagine is the rigor of determination of a subject who is unafraid to die a horrific, either immediate or rather slow death following grave injuries. And the act is irreparable, as the French student Maska put it in his pamphlet. And what makes it even crueler is that the self-burner addresses their plea to a public without that they will be there to receive the response. I recognize that there's a danger in fascination and awe that the act inspires, because both martyrdom and victimhood can overstate the heroism of a rather tragic end. Watching or imagining self-incineration, one registers the embodiment of pain made graphic. So it brings the question, for such a violent destruction of one's body, how much violence has this body absorbed? And if such an equation holds, the self-burner condemns the violence of their situation, their life becoming unlivable, by turning it against themselves and not to those that they publicly blame for their suffering. And in the last words, with which I would like to open the discussion around the third problem, which ties together the notion of crisis of care and unsustainable life, as Bojana has spoken about it. How are we to attend to irreparable acts of self-annihilation, which stand in dire contrast to neoliberal practices of self-care, vitalist intensity, self-optimization, self-enhancement? Self-care clearly stretches in a field that cannot be totalized, as Bojana put it so clearly. It's between survival, self-preservation, and then the competition for the best possible life one ought to live. And then self-burnings, which are testimonies of a deteriorated life of those who see no livable future on their horizon. So is it politically useful to approach these self-burnings as situations in which care is lacking, which is inextricably linked with social injustice? Or is social injustice more central to highlight and fight for, as care and emotional support cannot remedy the political problems at the core of it? And does this question actually pose a false dilemma between care and social justice, as they're inextricable? Are those who self-burn in individual protest remnants of an old-fashioned notion of the phantom citizens, whose spectacular public death also attests to their faith in the phantom public sphere? Like the differential production of precarity and vulnerability, so are knowledge and access to collective and self-organized care, or more experimental or activist resources of emotional health, unequally distributed. I think this is important. I would like to talk more about it if we have a chance. In my perspective, to attend to these self-burnings, we would do well to de-individualize them and rally them around trans-individual expressions of social and politically caused distress and alienation, rather than letting them dissolve in a myriad of individual casualties of neoliberalism. Then the challenge still remains as to how to organize processes which will transform suffering from the struggle to live to the struggle to live within a just world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both for your presentations. I think you've touched on many very crucial points in thinking about the present and about how to make our lives livable within this crisis of care and crisis of sustainability in other contexts. I thought to make to kind of address to you the thoughts that I had when I was listening to you now, and also reading your contributions when you send them to me, and then maybe you can pick up on some of the questions, and then we could open the discussion. I found very interesting that I think you both in a way brought up this idea of talking about the crisis of the sustainability of life as opposed to social reproduction in a different way. I think in Bojana's talk it was more explicit, but also Bojana, you, when talking about precarity and this kind of self-immolation as a protest against the conditions that make these lives unlivable, I think this idea of the sustainability of life comes to the fore, and it's very interesting to me how this differs from social reproduction, because there the social reproduction implies reproducing life for the sake of reproducing a system, so reproducing the labor force and so on. And here, with shifting the focus to life and to the sustainability of life, I think it's a very important conceptual shift, and maybe I thought you can also elaborate on that if you want, on why you chose this kind of shift. I was thinking about this issue of care that came up in both talks, of course, as a problematic issue as well as self-care, this kind of the neoliberal appropriation of self-care as this injunction to take care of ourselves, to be able to manage all the stress that comes with living in these variously precarious conditions, which are, of course, very different for very different subjects in different contexts. But in a way, the injunction, at least in the global north, is always take care of your health, of your well-being, so that you can manage stress and be resilient and flexible and so on. Without asking what causes the stress and the need to this kind of excessive attention to self-care. And Bojana brought up also this writing, this paper or essay by Sara Ahmed, where she contrasts this neoliberal idea of self-care with the radical black feminist practice. She takes it from Audre Lorde, I think, from her Cancer Diaries. Where she talks about self-care as warfare. And that's, of course, a very, very different context of self-care. And it's about a discussion about how, for particular groups whose lives are always rendered less livable than others, maybe, or are not deemed worth living, self-care becomes a radical political practice because it's a way of resistance as well. And I was in this kind of context, I was thinking about the tensions here between a depoliticized neoliberal self-care, enhancing flexibility and so on, and then this acts that you, Bojana, talked about, which is actually self-annihilation. So in a way, it's giving up all ideas of caring for oneself, and it's in a way performing the violence of the system that does not allow these lives to be lived in dignity. And I was thinking about this essay of Sara Ahmed because there the essay is not only a critique of this neoliberal self-care, but also of critiques of the feminist notion of self-care that come from what she calls white male leftists, that in a way say that even self-care in this kind of radical circles is always only a way of reproducing the system and actually not questioning it. And she has this, I think, quite powerful sentence where she says that that only those that have resources can afford not to be resourceful. And this made me think a bit about maybe the danger. I know there is not, and Bojana, you also mentioned the problem in romanticizing these acts and kind of seeing them as heroic individual big gestures, but yeah, I was a bit thinking about the tension between this kind of self-care of the dispossessed, which is usually also a collective and communitarian practice. It's not just about taking a bath and having enough sleep, right? It's about how to maintain our communities and those that we live with, and then this kind of irreparable, as you say, irreparable act of giving up. Not giving up all care, but actually deciding to self-annihilate. And I was worrying if the critique about neoliberal self-care that can come from this political reading of self-humiliation could also be in tension with this more radical practice or emancipatory practices of self-care, or if there is a danger there of kind of using one against the other, or if there is a way of thinking them together as well. And maybe the last kind of concern or idea that I had when hearing both of your papers about precarity and care, and I was thinking a lot about care lately, and of course it's a very problematic concept, But I think it's very important that you pointed out to Bojana, especially you emphasized the big differences in how care functions when some are excluded from public structures of caring, or even for communitarian forms of caring for each other. But I was thinking about the differences that are often overlooked, and some of them are, of course, very importantly politically marked by economic inequality, by race, by gender. There's also, however, I think care as a concept, I think, implies in a way a very basic inequality, because in a way it's for me difficult to think about it as an egalitarian relation. I think, Adriana Cavarero writes about it in Inclinations, that in a way it always implies someone taking care of someone else in the position of power that is unequal. So then my question becomes how to think about care when let's say our framework is an egalitarian politics or an emancipatory politics, how to kind of take care of all these inequalities that are material in many ways and inherent in all situations of care, and then in many other ways they are exacerbated, and there are many other inequalities added that come from systemic violence and systemic dispossession. And yes, I don't really have a very articulate thesis or questions, but somehow these things were going in my mind when I was reading your papers. So maybe if you have, you can start wherever you think.
I think it's really great because it's also something what I know also for you and for me, it's something what we are very busy with, and we are confronted with all these questions actually and addressing them. I was just thinking that now, because there were a lot of thoughts, but I was continuously thinking, so one is this, the work has to be done for sure, the work of differentiation, a historical critique, what you said, like what are the different contexts of care, Black feminism, what does it mean to speak about care in a queer context, in a context of marginal. I think this is very important. And but then there is something else what I think can also help us to deal with these problems, not to immediately slip in a kind of appropriation or generalization of notion or softening the political differences. And this is a technique and a practice. And I think if I was now thinking how to deal also with all what you say, I think we have to also analyze the practices. This is really, and here actually our background also in performance and so on becomes very, very important. And that's actually what Bojana also a little bit did now. It's really, this is very interesting because it is a practice, and it's a practice which is deeply involved and deeply, how to say, part of that, how to say, unequal distribution of bodily vulnerabilities. There is always, this is, as you said properly, it's not an egalitarian situation. It is deeply unbalanced act. But in this unbalanced act, there are very different dynamics which are very situated and very much connected to practice. And now I think that could also maybe help us to differentiate what does it mean to care. And I'm very close here. I was not talking about that a lot, but very influential for me is the work of Maria Puig de la Bella Casa, who does more this non-human aspect of care. Then I have to say also the work Tommy does and Valeria Graciano with radical care and all this research. And there was a lot of discussions also, like in several months now, around these notions. And I think there is very interesting because you are really dealing with practices. And this is important, I think, in this differentiation. So that would be maybe one of the ways how to go out of that traps, but these traps will always be there also. Because it's a deeply, it's a notion, I think it's also the shift, where do we place this notion? Is this an ontological notion? Is an ethical notion? What kind of ethics do we mean when we think it's a normative ethics, a situated ethics? I think here we have to do the work to come to that problems, what you are addressing. And this is something what I in my work would like to bring back to the notions of care and life and all these kind of notions which are dealing with our precarious relationality in arts. I'm very interested in how do we use them. And then there is another, what I mentioned very briefly, but this is really something what I am now totally in a rethinking. What if we would not so much think about care, maybe because also sometimes language is kind of seductive. And I'm really now rethinking the notion of maintenance. Also inspired by feminist work on maintenance and also architectural work on maintenance, and trying to think it through this, what a kind of temporality, spatiality, in the relation, of course, to a main organizational frame, which would be a management and so on. So this is also something what helps me a little bit to go through these different issues. But I didn't know answer. It's just a kind of thinking with you on these questions, how to, because also for me, still a lot of questions are very open, and sometimes I also felt they are very, very slippery, like they could be really reappropriated and misinterpreted in a very wrong way. But also your points, what you did now at the end, I think it's extremely important. It's this trans-individual. I think this is also what is in the core of how Maria Puig de la Bella Casa also thinks about care. No? She always talks about decentralization of the one who is doing care. It's a very different way also how to think a subject of care and so on. And also really going away from all the categories of good, bad, norms. This, I think, it's very important, and that comes out of the queer practices and so on. It's not a normative ethics, it's ethic of the situation, of community, of survival, and so maybe that I can just add, but not to answer, but just some thoughts.
I would like to comment one question that you posed. I think it's all the remarks you have made are very pertinent and worthwhile thinking through further, and especially as Bojana has so greatly put it, also in her talk. But specifically the question whether a political analysis of self-immolation would be counterproductive to a more radical stance on care, because it's about giving up care, or care is impossible, we have to fight for social injustice. It was one of the questions that I posited, because with this I would like to flag a problem I observe in radical practices of care that are activist, for which I often don't find access for those who are the most, let's say, on the margins, and who appear to our attention as glitches of a dysfunctional or infrastructural breakdown. And it is also a question of a repurposing of artistic work, because in the practices of radical care, we find renegade artists who gave up art and are not enlisting themselves in state organized social service, but redirect that within some ethics of care, and it has a performative dimension, and as also Bojana has emphasized, also that there is something rewarding, because I think also the crisis of the arts is nowadays also this dilemma whether to still operate within some kind of relative autonomy that is experienced as a privileged, where your life is protected, or to take up political and social work, and what kind of social engagement it will be. And I think that there is something about a homophily and alternativism of communities of care, where they have been often, I've been in situations where they have been called out on their misrecognition of all the differences that make this field distribute vulnerability in different way. For instance, there is also a discursive threshold that some people just don't pass. And where does this impossibility to collectivize come from? Who are these disenfranchised people that even cannot fall back on the support system of communities and their families that they come. So there is a large gap here. And in this talk, it's a bit odd to me, and I was a bit wondering, I was a bit insecure about whether to bring this on, because it's not within my purview normally. I'm not working on social psychology or sociology or political theory, but it was an attempt to look at something that is very remote and that is outside of the art field. Because around me there's so many artists that are now practicing rituals of care. This is also a new, somehow thematic orientation among the youngest, and it's very hard to not embrace it, because there are all good reasons for that, but also not to get satisfied by this politically. So.
There is just to add very shortly, because you also talk about Laurent Berlon. She has in this text on infrastructure a very interesting critique of the way how infrastructure, how care, in which way care articulates its in relation to infrastructure through the notion of repair. And she's very critical towards those notions of repair, that we need to repair something. And then I was really thinking like that a lot of art projects and so on was really in that, in that drive of repair, no? But this is very, and healing, no? So there is already something, so there and with the repair, you are taking your out of something what has to be repaired. So that's why I was thinking maintenance is maybe much better notion to think what is going on in this, that I'm totally glued, that things are they are continuously degrading, they are continuously falling apart and so on. So there's something very interesting in that, but this is something still I'm working on that, but Berlon is very critical. She said that repair was a kind of a main way of how leftist politics and also art scene was actually addressing those notions, but this is not the notion with which we can work with this. It's quite an interesting proposal, and I am thinking that probably because there are particular relations of power re-established, and it's actually not working in a kind of way exactly to even see these marginalities, like it's a continuous division. I don't know, even if, but that's something what I'm really, really busy with, but in a conceptual way, maybe that could be an interesting way how to think about it.
That's very interesting. I mean, when you mention this repair, it always connotes something that was whole before and is now broken, and then it needs to be made whole again. So while I wonder how maintenance, I don't know your work on that, but how this can become a different kind of thinking about sustaining that is not keeping the same or returning to the same, or what you mentioned before, this optimist idea, there is only if we care a bit more, we are going to be better and come out of this precarious situation better. So, yeah. Yes.
Journey. Thank you. And while you were bringing on the one hand so to say the movement from necropolitics to the focus on life, and on the other hand proposing the maintenance, I was then also taking the offered stones from also the introduction before, where there was very much like this notion of Yugoslav legacy put into debate, and then of course Bojana kind of past Yugoslav burning, so to say, for her talk. And so I'm basically, because maintenance, as you already said, like with management, I mean, this presupposes that life is, that and this is, I think, also in the core of the concept of modernity that was very much shared also within the Yugoslav, so to say, modernization ideology. And I mean, here among us today are people that insisted on, so to say, self-immolation of Yugoslavia, that it's not individualized, that it's politicized. And of course, as you know, someone who only grew up in the late periods of Yugoslavia, already scarred with global financial crisis and the loan policy and so forth, the rise, so to say, of liberalism. It's of course very, very, very difficult to kind of imagine this Jetztzeit in Benjamin terms of, you know, like really self-management. It was really public, it wasn't state, so like it's not so easy to reconstruct, so to say, like what is the origin of what we nevertheless bring with ourselves. And this is where I would like to, so to say, ask in this maintenance, management, self-care, the insistence of life. There is a quote it's authored by Simone de Beauvoir, and she says, it's not in giving life, but in risking life that man is raised above the animal. That's why superiority has been accorded in humanity not to the sex that brings forth, but to that which kills, which is, of course, again, the modernity. But within this concept of modernity, of ever extracting life, which is there, which is never vanishing, which is, you know, to the last calorie, to be, so to say, digested, like, where would you then put the maintenance in this, like, what was this paradigm, so to say, differ, this Füllhorn of life?
I don't know yet. I said to myself, I should not bring this notion into the discussion because I'm really working on it in the moment and I have a lot of questions. But there is something, so I was very, I tried to reread also a lot, like from arts, like, you know, also Mierle Lader-Menukeles and her maintenance manifesto, which is totally different historical part. But there is something also in the sense that she actually dealt with that in a radical crisis of infrastructure in New York when all the trash services got privatized and so on. So this embodied relation that she dealt suddenly with the maintenance as an act process, which is not just one artwork. We know how she then became a resident artist by the trash sanitary department where she is still now. And I was thinking this is a very interesting re-articulation of what the artist does and so on. And for me, that was very much different from this kind of extraction of life because it has totally another temporality. And it's totally useful on one side because you always have to repeat it. It's a little bit like Hannah Arendt said that you always have to, actually the life is always decaying and you always have to repeat and clean. And there are these kind of repetitive works of maybe also care, we can say, who are totally boring, and that's why care in German is also Tugend. It's a burden, no? And this is really, and here I was thinking, wow, that could maybe be an interesting conceptualization of a mode of working which would have very different principle of relationality than management, which is so much a form of how do we work in arts. And this is what I'm now working on. So I don't know where I will come. Maybe I will still see, no, that's not a conceptually good work. But for me now, it's better than care. Care is this kind of ethical notion, which I could read then like situated notion and so on. but I'm a little bit very resistant at the moment because it's so much, it's so fluid now, fluidly used, and that's maybe, I don't know how to answer differently, but this is how I understand it. So it's not a kind of modernistic notion, it's more like environmental, like a trashy, yeah, I mean, it's, maybe we have to take it out also of its engineering imagination and think it really like Mierle did it, yeah. Now I will do a project where I will hold hands of all the sanitary workers in New York, but what does it temporarily means and so on. So this, and then there is another project which also I was then thinking, what is a maintenance? Of course, it's this, which was very discussed, but in a totally another frame, in temporality, like, no, I got the name, Adrian Hitfield wrote a lot about this Chinese, Taiwanese, yeah, no? So this is also a very interesting aspect to look at from another perspective, or, by example, a lot of feminist artists who just step out, like Carla Lonzi, or, I was thinking, could I maybe through this notion actually grasp what is going on there? But this is still the work which has to be done. So, but it's a very interesting question, and it's just, I really think we need a kind of to reconceptualize, or also maybe to appropriate some terms, maybe to express better what are the problems, and maybe not use the ones who are now so much reproduced and circulating around.
If I can add something on the maintenance as opposed to care, or difference towards care, I find that it's interesting that maintenance offers the link to apparatuses and institutions. So we can think institutions and with maintenance, and an example comes to my mind. It's Laurence Rassel, who is currently the director of École de Recherche Graphique, ERG, in Brussels, and she completed a master thesis in institutional psychoanalysis, which is more like institutional therapy, schizoanalysis after Laborde and Guattari's work. And she used the notion of care, but it has no, how should I say, ethical and also this gendered connotation to it. It was about opening up a school on all this level and collectivizing the processes, for instance, of financing, cleaning, and cleaning especially as this repetitive labor of maintaining an institution. It's a large school of about 1,000 students, so it's quite chaotic. But I think that for me would be also an example where we can think about in impersonal terms, immediately collective, instead of who cares for whom, but we have to engage with maintenance.
This is highly inspirational and challenging. I have so many thoughts to care, maintenance, repair, and I guess Marcel and I have used for our work around book piracy, custodianship. But I would like to comment on something else. Both of your talks made me think, so the notion of sustainability or sustaining conditions of life and then self-immolation made me think that the political is not life or making someone live, making oneself live, but the limits to life. And this is an eminently environmentalist or ecological question, starting with the limits to growth and so on and so forth. But in a way, what's political in it is the question, what regulates the limits to life? One could interpret, for instance, class war in terms of limits to life. No, you sell your labor time. That's time of your life that you sell to somebody else's regulation, and therefore you lose that bit of life or control and regulation of that bit of life. And you can scale it then on larger issues of class relations in society, labor market. So that's one aspect. Another aspect, and I think this is highly interesting from a theoretical point of view, where does self-limitation of a society, of a human society, set in? How do we theorize that? For instance, affluent societies vis-a-vis less affluent societies. So say climate justice is that's sort of a question. But even more fundamentally, it's the expansion of human life as opposed to non-human nature, which I think we don't have other than Kantian framework to fall back on to understand that there are two separate. Knosgaard does that, like how to understand the rights of animals or the rights of natural systems, which can't claim rights, etc. So there is kind of an asymmetry of understanding of both duty, rights, interconnectedness, and it's a highly challenging question for human societies. Where do we set limits? How do we withdraw in order to sustain natural systems? Also, in a way, sustaining ourselves in a world that is highly, or kind of planetary system that is highly destabilized and might lead to human extinction. But I think these are the questions that politicize the question of the limit. And acts of self-immolation, I would say, are claiming that limit to life, that it's not something else that regulates, limits your life, but in that extreme act, you reclaim your capacity to limit life and to set where is the limit of life. No. It's abstract, but life is abstract.
No, it's, thank you very much. I think this is really an important point, and it gives also an aspect. I was thinking a lot how actually in an interesting way then we can also think about care, because if we relate it exactly to this question of the limits of life, then we are really confronted. It's really radical shift in the whole also ethical or ontological understanding of care, because it's really radical shift into how also to let something, and that's something I was thinking when I was listening to you. This is, by example, this radical proposal to think care more in a non or beyond the human way, how she said what Maria Puig de la Ballacasa wanted to do. This is really radical shift to that. And I think then maybe what you propose now, but it's a very difficult philosophical work we have to do, but this will help us to deal with these paradoxes, what Katja pointed out, how we are continuously stepping back to this problem of the problem is appropriated and so on, because there is actually the core of the problem while these issues are also discussed. So I really appreciate that, what you point out, yeah. It's, yeah.
Maybe talking about care, we can touch also a question of institutional care. One of the biggest problems that appeared with pandemic here, but also in other places, are houses of elderly people. So one would say like the place where care should be maintained in a kind of highest professional ethical level, and it collapsed. And it became those places, institutional places of care became kind of stigmatized as a hotspots for and isolated and in a way abandoned from the landscape. So this would be one question. The other, listening to like two strongest concepts of each of you that for me that resonate, the crisis of sustainability of life, and then taking life, your own life. could we just could we bring another concept here that maybe is bringing a kind of how can I say, more dramatic way what we are talking about, and it's a question of survival. Because if I think about sustainability of life, what else that means, that basically create conditions that life can go on. You were elaborating this much more in details and so on, but I was thinking about this, and I wanted to bring this notion also in terms of what Tom was bringing, what are social antagonisms that actually bring whatever concepts we take. What are the social antagonisms, not only when it comes to institutional position, but also when it comes to the crisis. I think crisis is, I understand it as a political concept, so the situation in which social antagonism expand in such a way that they cannot be cannot hold the situation as it has been until that moment.
Do you want to respond, or we collect the question first?
I just want to point out that this crisis of sustainability of life should be thought always in a relation to crisis of care. It's really a geopolitical constellation. It's a historical, political, economic constellation also of capitalism we are living, because otherwise, again, it becomes a very problematic notion. What I mean with that is that there is an interconnection between, and here we are confronting then the limits of life, between the capitalism which extracts, destroys the environment. The crisis of sustainability of life has a reason. And this is always very important when we think about it, and it's intrinsically connected with the crisis of care on the north and a kind of professionalization of care, migrant working forces and so on. This is what Precarity, they are like building this kind of scheme, how we have to think about it. And for me, this scheme is very helpful because it always keeps returning me to that what actually is an economic, political ground, and like where destruction is actually happening. What are the powers of destruction? So if we would go to very micro-political situation like it's the elderly homes, all these kind of symptoms can be read there. And this is the problem. So it's not just a local problem. All the symptoms are read there. The way how care is organized, how is managed, the way what is the position of the elderly people in the society. Why do we have in this crisis then talk about the problematic Italians who have their fathers at home? What is that? I think, and this is all is connected to that kind of shift of relations. And we can only think about that like that. It's just, I'm just thinking how you ask, because it's very important for me to think it in this context. Because otherwise it again becomes, it again becomes a kind of depoliticized notion we are using for our own individual understanding of what is happening to us. So it's just this, I think in that way we can maybe go further to understand the paradoxes we all experienced in the last months also. Yeah.
Thank you very much again for another brilliant conversation, and I will actually, I will relate a lot to it in my own talk later on, but about the notions of that Tom was bringing up, so human, non-human interdependency, as well as repair and maintenance. Personally, I found a lot, I am indebted to and kind of committed to seeing the emergencies and making actually conditions possible to have the First Nation thought bringing into our ways of thinking, because the repair and maintenance, as you have been talking about, has been part of their life forms since decades, and that's why the anthropologists, critical anthropology work, I believe, is quite informing for understanding actually where we perceive that the crisis actually stands for us, being subjects belonging to some kind of contemporary world, whereas for them this has been going on since centuries, and they have actually found, but also keep on having very structured tasks within their communities. Specifically, for example, I'm talking about certain Aboriginal communities that are around Sydney areas, and for them, for example, the word healing is a word for surviving. This is what their community is about. They have to be healing towards each other, and that's the way that they can survive throughout all kinds of crises that they have gone through colonization to recently pandemics. So it's just very, I think, it can be enriching for us to think in the way that Tom was saying also about who is the caretaker, who is the caregiver when we are confronted with environmental issues, when we are confronted with the issues of us belonging to something that we called art field, and where we see that there has been a even if it was almost erased, the life itself has had a continuity in those communities. And they testify to that more and more by also belonging more and more, let's say, to the fields of academia today, through which they actually are finally also able to speak about how they do things and how do they think relations and their relation to the world.
Thank you for these comments. Did you want to respond, or yeah?
Elizabeth Povinelli is doing with Carabin Film Collective.
We worked.
Of course, and the way how they analyze their own situation, and this is really something. But still, I said, yeah, but still there is this kind of, how to say, I think we need even more radical proposal, not because, but it's the way that there is still a kind of a power relationship where this comes through. We are still the guardians, the West, of the truths of the other. So how to deal with this? I think it's really important institutionally to rethink. And here, for me, is, I would really say, maybe a kind of a radical rethinking also of the mode of operation and which are connected to the economization and management would be very interesting in that sense. And that's what I would like to go where, but it's a very, very difficult issue to think about. So one would be maybe that what also Bojana mentioned, there are more and more artists who are really not just abandoning, but they just do parallelly. But there could also be a kind of, what can these knowledges actually also do that these kind of practices or organizational modes and the way how are we then organizing that those contents are shared and experienced can be also radically changed. And that's the question, I think, in the core. But because this is the question of limits, again.
Exactly, and precisely because we should understand that these communities are not living somewhere outside of our systems today. You know, the First Nations communities are urbanized, and this for centuries as well. So it is, I think, an important perspective to take into account. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think we'll need to slowly wrap this up, but maybe just in the end, I just wanted to return to a point that I found really interesting, because the question of survival was brought up now. I think Janez and you also brought it up, and what I found really interesting in your paper, Bojana, is when you brought the notion of dignity and the idea that it's not just the right to life or to survive, but it's actually about a right to live well in a way, or to and so, yeah, maybe I just thought that it's interesting also to think about that in a way also these protests, and when you think about how to organize care or maintenance or something else, it's, yeah, to not to think just about survival, but actually about a good life or about dignity, as you said. And what I wondered about this notion is also how do you think of it in collective terms, because it seems it's so attached to this Kantian heritage of subjectivity and autonomy. But yes, so I don't know if you have thoughts on that, or should we just wrap this? Yeah.
We leave it at this, because then I think we will open and you are around, but thank you very much. It's very important what you say. And I thank you everyone for the conversation.
I
Yes.
knew that this would be very intense.